Hailing from the year 2000, Diablo 2 is considered one of the all-time PC gaming greats. Developed by Blizzard North, it was a sensation on release, a staple of the action RPG genre, and is still beloved to this day. 21 years on though, Blizzard has seen fit to now give it something of a refresh, bringing it up to speed at least in its visuals. A new remaster developed in collaboration with Vicarious Visions that adds much improved 3D models and environments. It's available on every last and current gen PlayStation and Xbox console too, plus even a Switch port. So how do they all compare? Does the frame rate hold at 60 FPS on newer consoles or a solid 30 on Switch? And perhaps most crucially, what of the game's legacy mode, letting you play as the developer intended back on release? To find out, I have invited none other than Alex Battaglia. How's it going?
Hey there, Tom. Yeah, I really like Diablo 1 and Diablo 2. Recently, when I set up a Windows 98 PC, I installed that as one of the first games there, checking it out again, loving it all these years later. I was originally very skeptical when they were showing this off for the first time because I have a very burnt taste in my mouth regarding remasters from Blizzard, but seeing Vicarious Visions on this, who have a very different pedigree of games, they have not actually worked essentially on any of these titles before in the past, and definitely not action RPGs like Diablo. So I'm surprised by the quality here in some ways and interested to see how it turned out on console.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot to unpack here. Well, we've got all the consoles and we're going to dive into each in turn and explain how each runs, but it's fairly straightforward, I'd say, overall there. What is interesting is what's included in the box on all formats, which is, reworked 3D visuals running over the original legacy 2D sprites and the engine and the framework and the netcode. It's a fascinating project. It's kind of like, if you remember Monkey Island, the remasters there, where you could swap between the old and the new. And it's also a very bizarre package in terms of, there are some aspects that we wish that Blizzard and Vicarious could have gone further in, but we also know that it would have defied the way the game is originally meant to be played, and fans have a set idea of how Diablo 2 played back then, and that would infringe on the nostalgia factor. So it's a delicate balance, and by adding this toggle that swaps between the old legacy mode graphics and the Resurrection remaster graphics, that's kind of a compromise that works for everybody. But at its core, everything about this game runs with the same mechanics, with a few exceptions. There's a few quality of life tweaks in there as well.
Yeah, that was something that we also saw in Command & Conquer Remastered recently, where the old game has certain ticks to it that fans definitely don't want changed, but there are definitely quality of life things that people want to see this day and age. Small automations of things that were manual last time around that were just tedious. And I'm happy to see that because not everything was best as it could be back then. There were compromises. Developments are not always perfect. So I'm happy that it made some smaller, sensible changes there. But I think we should get right into those comparisons to talk a bit about some more of those graphics later on. So Tom, tell me, on PC, I know people are playing this like maxed out 4K 60, whatever, how is it actually faring on these current gen big machines like PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X?
So the big gun consoles, Series X, PS5, Series S are kind of in focus today, but it's worth saying the last gen versions all run at 30 FPS. But we didn't have quite enough time to cover them today, being as many modes and given all the consoles we've got here.
Yeah.
So worth mentioning there, but there's a difficulty here in comparing them all side by side because Diablo 2 famously is procedurally generated. All the maps, even the opening hub areas have kind of a level of randomization. But we can go through each in turn. So Xbox Series X, you've got two modes. You've got your quality mode, which runs at 30 FPS. That targets 4K. With dynamic resolution scaling and what appears to be reconstruction as well to help it there, which might explain why there's a little bit of a sort of a blur. I'm not sure if it's a motion blur.
It does look like everything on the camera moves. I'm not sure if it is a motion blur because just looking through the footage that you're presenting me with here, it does kind of remind me of like a slight ghosting of the previous frame, actually, honestly.
It does, yeah. So that's quality mode. If we switch over to performance mode, this goes to 60, as you'd expect. The resolution then drops to 1440p, which is, kind of your boilerplate approach to a performance mode in this generation, I've noticed. 1440p 60 versus 4K 30. Yeah, visuals still hold up, but, I've got to say the fine-grained detailing on grass, and there's a lot of elements here that do obviously soften with 1440p as the active resolution. And again, there's DRS in effect here, so it can go potentially lower. I've seen down to about 1080p around that mark. So it's variable, but mostly it's about 1440p most of the time. So that's PS5 and Series X, and that's the way they work.
Very similar in that aspect there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it does feel like I'm throwing numbers out at you, Alex. Sorry about this.
No, that's all right. I mean, this is the part of the video we just kind of have to get through. In general, just based upon what you're saying here, it seems like the biggest trade-off is essentially just clarity of image when you're going down to that 60 FPS mode. Given the way they've redone the art here, you definitely will notice it for sure based upon the footage I'm seeing here. But honestly, 60 FPS is such a benefit for just motion and visual clarity that I would always take that hit. Even with DRS here going down, like you said, into that 1080p range on those consoles there, I think 60 FPS is totally worth it.
Yeah, no doubt. And we're going to get onto why that's such a relief these days, especially compared to the legacy mode. We'll get onto that a bit later. Okay, so Xbox Series S, less we forget this one because it's actually also keeping that toggle for performance and quality, and so you get a 1440p 30 FPS mode for the quality, and then you have 1080p at 60 FPS for the performance mode, so 1080p max, but it can drop as well under that. Again, all of this is based on testing right at the start of the game, to be honest. Most of this, it's kind of, we found like the desert city, the oasis in the second chapter of the game, but still there's a lot more, there's greater depths to plunge in Diablo 2 for sure, as fans will know. Right, so that leads us on to Switch, which takes another drop down, as you'd expect, and more so. So the Series S, X, and PS5 all share the same core visual settings, but the resolution differs between each, as you can understand. But then Switch is one where they have to obviously compromise a lot more to suit the Tegra X1's limits. Well, we've got a limit of 30 FPS for a start. That's the only mode we've got. But then we've also got a visual cutback. If we just look at the the character selection screen, we make a new character. This is a good example outside of procedurally generated play where we can see textures are lowered in quality. Rubble and terrain is massively different, lowered in quality on Switch as well, and shadows too. So clearly a lot of cutbacks there, but it's still the core game. What is also changed is the resolution side. 900p while docked, going down to 720p.
Yeah, the thing is, though, we're looking at this title that was designed for higher resolutions, and it seems to be using a form of temporal anti-aliasing to clean up a lot of its visuals. How does that hold up in the portable mode, which is, at a max at 720p? Does it actually look? Does it look okay?
They've done on a small screen, yeah, I think that's totally fine. We saw it in Diablo 3 as well, the Switch version, where 720p max is expected because that suits the screen, and then it will drop to 480p lowest using DRS. So there is a range, but yeah, in Diablo 2, that is the range, and we had a similar situation on Diablo 3, to be fair. So that kind of summarizes what we've got with these games and these consoles. Now, of course, performance is worth mentioning. The idea that we got a 60 FPS mode here is awesome, and really, I'm so glad we've got that in here. And I agree totally, Alex, that this is the way to play, and pretty much every console from Series X to PS5 nails it as far as the current gen newer machines go.
Did you notice any sort of world traversal issues? Because I'm just from playing games recently, playing Far Cry and whatnot, I'm so used to weird hiccups when you run across the world. Did you encounter any of that on PlayStation 5, Series X, or Series S at all in the 60 FPS?
Not so far, no. It's been pretty straightforward. Yeah, I mean nothing egregious really. Yeah, performance mode just flies on Series X and PS5 in that performance mode. No issues really, but again, this is a very early state of play in Diablo 2, but as a sample, this is kind of where we're at, and it's looking it's looking positive.
So how about Series S there, though? Because we're dealing with a machine that scales essentially in a very different way than Series X and PlayStation 5, where it'll drop down to around 720p or so. So it has a rather large range of resolution. How did that hold up in 60?
It's good so far. In this case, I did notice some limits. Like, all right, so this is maybe 1 or 2 missions in. We're in the plains area, kind of just a little bit into the game. And we're already dropping to like 50 to 60 FPS region. Okay, there are a lot of enemies on screen, which you can kind of herd up. But still, this is the territory of Diablo. And you will see this later on. So I don't think it's exceptional. One to watch out for, Series S did have more issues in the performance mode than the other 2 consoles. Now, the quality mode is there, obviously, 30 FPS on all flat platforms. There's no issue at all with those as far as frame rate goes. I've had a flawless 30 FPS experience there, which, might be an option if it is going to plummet to lower frame rates, but so far I don't think it's really worth resorting to that just yet. It's pretty playable on the 60 FPS modes.
Nice. Okay, so how about Switch here? Because 30 FPS lock, we see that it runs really well at the 30 FPS lock on PlayStation 5, Series X, and S. Does it maintain that on Switch as well?
Interestingly, I really thought this would be the one to buckle, not to be too down on Switch, but you know how it goes. And, from the character selection screen, it was running at about 25 FPS, so first impressions were a bit sort of, I was a little bit worried. But going into actual gameplay for the first chapter, it's actually really solid. It's a rock solid 30 so far. There may be drops, but it's not in these situations. And I think what they've done to the visual downgrades on this version, that has helped massively to keep it within a playable range at 30.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. It's a bit of a surprise. I'm not ruling out frame rate drops by any means, but this is so far looking much better, more solid, more consistent than I expected.
We've got generally awesome performance across all the machines, with some slight dips there on Series S when it gets a bit hairy in the 60 FPS mode, but generally good. So I think we should come here to the point of this video where we discuss the graphical presentation itself. I've been watching through the video, I've been following the game's development, I've played it myself on PC. In general, I think the aspect of it that I'm rather happy about in terms of the visual presentation of the new remastered graphics is that they did achieve the hyper rounded geometry, pre-rendered, look of that era's graphics. They were using essentially bitmapped versions of high poly renders. That's how StarCraft and a lot of games were made around this era. I think that is in itself really cool that they did that. But when you do go through a lot of these really awesome side-by-side comparisons that you've made here, you do see that there is definitely at times a change of color tone. The fact that the game now utilizes real-time lighting on a lot of aspects of the game's visuals, that is a positive usually we would say for video games, but at the same time we're talking about an older game here with a very distinct visual styling, so it will change the general appeal of the visuals while you're playing the game. It will look rather different, and whether or not you like that is going to be a very subjective thing. In general, I think it's pretty okay, but I can definitely see the argument that I would rather play with the old school graphics.
Yeah, I've got to admit I'm very torn on this one. There are definite pros and cons. A lot of them you've touched on already here. The 3D remaster visuals have a lot going for it in terms of modern rendering techniques. You've got the dynamic shadows, all the shadows cast by the buildings actually casting properly, and they're dynamic. If there's cloth on one of the building tops, you can see it projected onto the ground there, and it's actually moving. And then there's stuff like reflections, potentially screen space reflections, like in later dungeons. It all feels much more in line with the styling of Diablo 3. Which is awesome, but I can't shake this feeling. When I press that button to swap to the legacy mode, something is lost. Something intrinsic to the sprite work, the way the original artists envisioned it. There is a kind of charm to even the way it's pixelated, I guess. There's a lot of detail changed, like early dungeon areas where you just spawn, like cave entrances, where the revamp is extensive, like the stalactites are in a different position, lighting positions are different. There's a lot going on here in terms of taking artistic license, which I don't mind. It looks great, both sides in its own way, but I can't shake the feeling that if we're going for a nostalgia trip and revisiting Diablo as it was originally meant to be seen,
Mm-hmm.
I kind of do prefer the legacy mode in a few senses.
I definitely could get that, especially since they're very kind to you on even the consoles here, allow you to change some of those graphical options, unique to the original game regarding its rendering resolution, how the shadows are rendered, whether or not it's using that interesting glide 3D effects forced perspective mode, which added 3D elements to the game. Those are some nice touches. But at the same time, double-edged blade here. You can enjoy those legacy mapped graphics, but you have to deal with the legacy performance, right, Tom?
Yeah, this is it. Kind of where we're leading to. So pros, obviously, you get the option to have legacy mode graphics, but the con is, would you really want to? All right, so we've come a long way in 21 years, and back in the day, this game was running at 25 frames per second. The game logic, the way the camera pans, is fixed at 25 FPS. And most of the character animations also run at that rate. There are exceptions, but mostly 25 FPS. So when you jump from the Resurrection Remaster, and you can see it in side-by-sides quite clearly, even slowed down. Yeah, brutal. It looks very juddery and jerky. It might be part of your sort of nostalgia trip, if you like, but it's definitely something that I don't miss going back to that. Originally, we had the mod scene around Diablo, which fixed this. You could actually make the game run, at least the camera could pan at 60 FPS or something close to it. It made it smoother to play. The idea being that you couldn't play it online, you could enjoy the mod offline. But online, the whole game logic revolved around a 25 FPS update to stay in sync with other players across Battle.net. So we were kind of stuck, and I don't think the mod entirely solves everything. But yeah, it's just a shame that given the amount of work that went into this remaster package, that the legacy mode couldn't in some way be updated.
That is surprising that they did not opt for that, because even things like for example the original Doom or Doom 2, those games have a refresh tick of 35 frames per second because it was run on 70 hertz displays back then. But the various ports of that over time have at least added in animation interpolation that did not affect the base game logic, so you could have at least 60 hertz camera motion, even though obviously the game world itself would still be updating at 35. That is something that I would have really liked to have seen for the original base legacy version of the game here, because just watching it, you have like the 25 hertz movement of the camera and the animations themselves, but then there's also like weird things in the world that still, like the name tags or something like that update at 60 or so. So it is a bit of a shame, because I actually would have loved to play this through in legacy mode graphics, but with a proper 60 FPS interpolation.
Yeah, it's definitely a downside. As much as I love the nostalgia trip of revisiting legacy visuals, this is kind of hard to overlook, and it was an issue back then. It's an issue especially now that we can jump so freely between these two modes and see the difference.
Okay, so what was your conclusion at the end of all this, after having looked at all these different versions of the game?
I think I can see the developer standpoint on why they held back so much, because obviously the fans love this game. There's such a fervor for Diablo as a franchise, and any change to the game is going to draw some criticism, let's say. And so I think the developers were in an impossible position in terms of how far they could change it, how much they could tweak it to modernize the original game and the mechanics. For me personally, I would have liked to have seen 60 FPS in the legacy mode to play it that way. As much of an overhaul that might have taken them to implement that, that's kind of what I wanted to see and how I wanted to enjoy Diablo 2 today with the original visuals. But I do also really respect the work that Vicarious did on the 3D reworking, and it looks great. It's a fine way to revisit. All right, well, I think that about covers it. Thanks again, Alex, for joining me on this one.
Of course, there, Tom.
And let's round out here. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for notifications as any new video lands. We have a high quality version of this video at our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with myself or Alex, just use Twitter. But from the both of us, thanks for watching.